and we are in early December, we'll be working on the Community of Practice Data to Action URL. Many people have a link to, but we'll be updating it with all of the resources that we've been sending out every month. So you'll hear more about that next month. The Community Practice, which is the last one this year, which will be December. So we're going to actually have a really exciting presentation by one of our peers, Tim Hoffman, who volunteered way back when to actually talk with us about qualitative study designs that he does in homelessness field in the St. Louis region. But before we get there, let's go to the next slide, Ross. Well, there we have it. So I want to just spend just a couple minutes on the shared housing follow-up. We've had a wonderful call with 3 shared housing providers, which was our second call on the topic. And just in general, I'm just wondering if anybody who's on the call today was motivated to take any of that information to do any kind of follow-up step on shared housing, or has HUD kept you too busy with all of their new HR requirements? So we really do understand that's a true limitation, but just wondering if anyone has followed up with that in any way, the shared housing information. I'm going to take that as a no. But we do. Go ahead.
Yeah, it's Amy Appleton, and I was one of the providers for that particular conference call. I had several people call me for, wanting more information and data. As an FYI.
Oh, they did. They followed up. Very, very good. That's wonderful.
Yeah, thank you.
And that's what we focused. Yeah. That's great. Well, we are submitting with LaSAR, our LaSAR development consultants. We're submitting for quite a bit of funding that will support a toolkit and work plan development. We'll be starting with Los Angeles and San Diego. That's where the funders are, and it looks like Utah will also be joining us. We're under discussions with that, but so that toolkit will be made available hopefully by mid of next year to the broader public. There'll be more on shared housing and promising practices and other resources to contact as we move forward on it. It's a really important topic, something we can all be working on sooner than later. So today, again, we're having a wonderful session on how we can expand our own partnerships and work as we look into how we see data and use data from our going beyond our HMIS data results. So Tim Huffman's actually a university professor at a university that I can't name right now, Tim, but you can when yourself. He does, one of his areas of expertise is nonviolent communication. And when I heard that, it was really striking to me. Just that is actually the core area of philosophy that he's centered in, and that most of his work in the research side is being done in homelessness arena. So I'll let Tim describe a little bit more about what's inspired him to arc that work on nonviolent communication as his own area of expertise and research into the homelessness world. But Tim, over to you, and Ross will switch the screen over to you also.
Perfect. So first off, can everybody hear me?
Yes.
Okay, perfect.
Yeah.
So as Jamie says, my name is Tim, and I am a professor at St. Louis University. My path has crossed back and forth between the practitioner professor divide. I've worked as a volunteer, as a director inside homeless serving nonprofit organizations, but also worked obviously as a graduate student and now as a professor. And so my world really blends the kind of more engaged research on the university side and the kind of research-driven practice on the professional side. And so when we were getting together and talking about the things that how we incorporate data into our practice, my field of training is in and around qualitative research. And so I have over the last decade run a variety of qualitative research projects in permanent supportive housing organizations, in drop-in centers, outreach organizations, professional development organizations, green jobs, therapeutic horticulture organizations, and I'm doing my first one with shelters this winter. So really what motivates me with regard to qualitative research in the field of human services is that people's experiences are so different in different aspects of the social sphere. Walking into a building feels differently for different people based on their lived experiences. And so case managers know that, direct service staff know that. That's their work, is to sort through those experiences. But it's really been my pleasure and honor to dig through that in deep ways to help create tools for action for people who are trying to do the best for their residents or their consumers or their clients. So I want to start with just a couple of questions before we get into the details. And so there are 3 questions that should be visible on your screen. If not, I don't know how to fix that, so I sure hope they are. And they are, how might qualitative inquiry benefit your community's homeless service system? The other way you can think about it is, do you have questions that the data you currently have doesn't answer? So anybody be willing to reflect on the answer to one or the 2 of those questions?
I have questions. I'm sorry, this is Jason Robinson. I was a provider last time, and we have in our continuum of care, can everybody hear me?
I can.
Okay, so one of the questions that we don't have the data to answer, we do demographic surveys as part of our homeless count every year, and one of the things that we're not collecting information on is what keeps people from connecting with our services. We don't have a consumer or a customer service approach. We don't understand why people don't want to talk to us.
Right, and that's great. And honestly, that's a great thinking qualitatively. While you could give people 3 options and have them pick one, if you provided them the options and you didn't provide them the one that they really believed, then what would the point of that be in the first place, right? And so really actually sitting with people and talking with them, or getting a group of people together to talk about that really would be the best, most vibrant way to get an answer to that question. Love it. Other folks, either riffing off that or something else entirely.
Hi, Tim. This is Amy Appleton from Share, California, up in Sonoma County, California. I'm primarily focused with those who are 55 years and older. All of our funding through Housing First traditionally at this point goes through Sonoma County to focus on the 3,000 chronic homeless folks. There's hardly any data which I can actually provide some, but all of those other people who are now newly becoming homeless for the first time in their lives, couch surfing, at risk, unstably housed, and because there's no affordable housing, I'm not even calling it affordable housing, it's now just attainable housing. If you have $900 a month, of income through whatever social security or disability, what is attainable housing for you? Probably you can't pay anything, right? So that's the data, that I'm concerned about, is The folks that are now entering the shelter system, 55 and older, who've never experienced homelessness, have no idea what a shelter is all about. But we're starting to see more and more people enter the shelter system. But all of those couch surfers and all those people who are out there in the gray, just out there on the fringe, I don't see any data on that. What does that look like?
For qualitative research to really bring that down, like what would be a question you would have about the elderly entering your system? What would be a real specific question you'd want to have answered, Amy, around that, around elderly or growing number of elderly entering the homeless service system?
Literally what happened for them. Sonoma County, it's easy to say because of the wildfires, but there's a real trend going on here, and I think more, certainly outside of Sonoma County. But what happened to this person that now they're in the shelter system? They're older, they're traumatized. There should probably be special services within the shelter system specifically for this population, which is growing.
Yeah, that's good. Okay, over to you, Tim. That's a good question.
Yeah, I love it. So, and how do I say? I'm not at all here to try to convince people that qualitative inquiry should usurp quantitative inquiry. And in a perfect world, we'd find some way of collecting really good, broad, reliable, and valid data about that entire population. But one of the things that we often find is that we're in some way spoiled by the fact that people show up to us and then we ask them questions. So it's very easy to survey them. But if you're dealing with a community that has been traditionally not engaged with our overall data system, they're like ghosts to us. We can't see them. And so how could you spool up a qualitative research project that would be very targeted, and you could do some very strategic snowball sampling to be able to get into conversation with folks so that you could start building out a picture of what actually it all looks like. Love it. Right. Okay, so hopefully you will have even more questions as we go through the course of today. But feel free to keep, for those of you who've spoken and haven't, keep kind of your questions in mind as we start to kind of walk through what the steps of these things are, and maybe we can flesh out some real projects. But before we get into all of that, I kind of wanted to step back and think about how qualitative inquiry can connect up with the broader data systems that we currently use. And so I am going to ironically begin with a survey. So I want you to grab a pen and make a hash mark every time you've heard a comment that I read or a similar sentiment, or you can count on your fingers if you have 10 fingers. So I'm going to ask 10 questions. And so the question is, how many times have you heard a statement, this statement, or a statement very much like this? So question 1, let's stop making strategic decisions based on anecdotes. Question 2, if you can't measure a change, it isn't real. Show me hard data. Number 3, numbers only paint part of the picture. Number 4, we need to incorporate client voice into our decision making. Number 5, the only people who know what's really going on are the ones who are on the ground or on the streets. Number 6, in the nonprofit world, you need to be able to tell a good story. Number 7, funders want numbers. Number 8, we only collect the data because it's mandated by the grant. Number 9, I don't trust that count, or I don't trust that assessment. And number 10, I may be the only person who remembers, but actually we used to ... Fill in a historical reflection here. So I'm wondering how you did, how I did, in fact. How many of these sentiments have you heard in your work in nonprofit human services? Shout out your score.
All of them. Yeah, all but one.
All of the above, for sure.
So these things I hear all of the time in all kinds of ways. I would say that like 60% of the fights I've ever been were started by one of these questions or statements, actually. And the reason I start with this is because what each of these questions or each of these claims is making some kind of argument about what counts as evidence. And if you want the technical term, they're statements about warrant. They're basically statements about whether or not a particular kinds of evidence supports another kind of argument. And we could go through and have a philosophical discussion about the paradigmatic underpinnings of each of these questions. They're about how non-systematic data is insufficient, how quantitative data is valuable, how participatory design is valuable, how direct experience or narrative framing or historical frames are valuable. They're about data partiality. They're about stakeholders being epistemically different. They're about how our data systems are power-laden and how inquiry always involves uncertainty. And so while the sentiments all vary, depending on the situation, you might yourself find yourself making one of those arguments. And I have probably uttered something similar to every single one of those statements too, because the truth of it is, not one kind of thinking about support and inquiry doesn't get us through everything. And we just know that sometimes when we show up to a fundraising event, we're going to want to lean more on the stories. And when we're filling out, a form justifying system performance, we're going to rely on different kind of data. And so it's into that space that I'd like to have this conversation about qualitative inquiry, not about how it's better, or this sort of thing, but rather how does it supplement and connect to the systems that are already in place. So yes, let's use our HMIS to its highest usefulness and modify and evaluate our metrics, but as the situation calls for it, good qualitative inquiry is really powerful. So that is what we're going to do today. So we're going to talk about what counts as qualitative inquiry. We'll review the data action cycle and think about how qualitative inquiry connects to that. We'll talk about why we use qualitative inquiry, which is very tied to when we start using qualitative inquiry. And we'll talk a little bit about how it can be performed, although I will just disabuse you of the notion that I'm going to teach you how to do all of this right in this call. Really, this is getting a vocabulary for talking about it and being able to start the planning process. But my hope is that we'll also recognize our shortcomings and know when to partner to add to our capacity and insight with regard to this kind of inquiry, which is the next thing we'll also talk about, which is who should be involved, where does it happen, some questions and considerations, and then we'll end with a commercial about the next data to action date. So does anybody have any questions before we move forward? Hearing none, I will roll forward. So what counts as qualitative inquiry? There are 1,000 different terms and differences and specializations and all kinds of things, but roughly they fall into 3 categories, which are illustrated in Sharpie on the right. Going into the world and seeing what is actually happening. We tend to call that field observation, taking field notes. We also think of qualitative inquiry as the knowledge that is generated through interaction, and we call those interactions interviews. So it's information seeking or knowledge co-creating interaction. And we also think about it in terms of getting groups of people together to discuss or to design or build answers to questions or new models. And so what all of these things have in common is that they're experiential. So if I had to pick one word for qualitative inquiry, it would be experience. And if I had to pick 2, the second would be context. So when you walk into a drop-in center or a shelter to do field observations, you're privileging the value of having direct experience in that space and thinking about your experience and being mindful of that. And when I sit and I talk with you in interview, I'm really asking you, what is your experience? What is it like for you to move through the system or to access this program? And with regard to focus groups, the goal is to find people with similar enough experiences that the conversation that they have highlights things that even maybe just a conversation with them on an individual basis would miss. So that's my like 90-second summary of what qualitative research is. So what I want to do is, having covered that, I want to ask, have any of us been involved in a qualitative research project in the past? If someone has done this, I would love it if you'd be willing to share and let me ask you some questions about how that went.
So I can share, Tim, actually. It's Jamie.
Hi, Jamie.
We received some funding from HUD Research to do a qualitative interviews with families who had participated in the family options study. And our little arm of the study was to go to those families and ask them about their experience in accessing So all of them are people who had been homeless at one point and had got into housing, either permanent supportive housing, or Section 8, or rapid rehousing. And we did interviews in their home or in a common place. Two things to it that were really striking was, one, like literally going into people's homes and doing an interview was such an amazing experience of just being grounded in their reality, being able to see, like, one woman in their apartment, they had 2 chairs. Her brother had broken the other chair. He lived with her to be able to afford the rent. And I can remember, actually, another colleague and I were sitting with the mom in the living room the whole time doing the interview. And as we left, we walked out, and there was a room that had a lot of, I remember a car seat, and there was a bed in there, and there was a young child who was probably a little over 1 year old, not in a playpen, not in any secure area, who was awake in that room that whole time. Very, very, very young. I remember just feeling like just struck by the difference, really, in the education of knowing, like, in my socioeconomic connections, that child at that age would never have been left alone. And these moms, like, it was striking to just understand the link of our education and the opportunities that we get and gain from that in awareness, and how that intersects with everything else. Another woman was working at Yale, working under Yale's system, was rapid rehousing, and her rent, I remember, was over $900. And so the only way she was going to be able to meet it for her plan, and she had, all of them had many creative ways to deal with preschool care or preschool access. But she was actually going to have a friend move in with her in order to be able to move, to make that rent. But you learn a lot about housing ability, learn a lot about, like, connection of family and the power of the family network and the support of that. But so I loved the experience doing that, and then actually getting all the data and organizing it with a team. There were 4 of us on the team, organizing what that meant by themes and sub-themes in order to summarize was really a powerful experience.
So part of what I hear you saying, you answered all of the questions I would have asked, by the way. But part of what I hear you saying is that you valued its kind of holistic approach to the person, seeing the person and in their place and their culture and their socioeconomics and understanding their family networks. But I also hear you saying that you really valued the kind of collaborative nature of the meaning making that happened after the data was generated, right? Sitting together and trying to make sense of, all of these different things. Right.
I don't think it could have been done by 1 or even 2 people. Like, it was really good to have, when you're coming up with the themes that you start with from research, then you code them, but you have to argue. We argued. I like arguing, but we argued, and that, I think, makes for a greater understanding with difference of opinions to get at what it is you think is the highest level findings there.
Love it. Have anybody else in the community of practice been involved in the qualitative research project?
I think it's a no, Tim. I don't
Yeah,
know.
I'm hearing a no. Yeah, so we'll have a chance to brainstorm possible projects, because if you've never done one, then maybe the more important question is, which ones would you like to do? But I'm going to ask that question after the next slide. So, or after the next 2 slides. So this is a framework that Jamie and friends have developed for thinking about how data is connected to action and vice versa. And really, it's kind of from this pragmatic inquiry philosophy, which is that we ask questions and we think about our data in relationship to real strategies and priorities and programming that we do in the world. And you can kind of look at this slide on your own. I'm not going to read it to you, as I assume you can read it on your own. But it moves cyclically through the analytic, prioritizing, problem solving, executing, evaluating, and goal reviewing activities. And so one of the ways to think about qualitative research is that actually any of these activities could have a, I don't know if you can you see my mouse? If I wiggle my mouse, do you see this?
Yes, yes.
Yeah, so as you're tracing down these things, the way I imagine qualitative research is you can kind of like spool out and kind of circle qualitatively in one of the phases, and then continue along the path. And so basically, like as you're moving through this cycle, you might discover that you want to evaluate something, but evaluate it from a community level instead of just like an executive staff perspective. And so you pull focus groups together in order to do that. And then as you're reviewing your community's goals and analyzing whether or not you're getting them, you might draw other people into the analysis and do like a community of practice based thing. And obviously prioritization could be informed by interviews or by observations, and so too problem solving and whatnot. And so this is a framework Jamie and I overall have used towards data, but I think it's a really healthy way of thinking about how things like qualitative research, they move through the various stages of this data action cycle. So what I want to turn to is why and when to use qualitative inquiry. And I think that the best way of framing that is in terms of what sparks qualitative inquiry. But before I get there, I want to talk about why qualitative inquiry is good. And I really have to restrain myself. I'm only giving myself 2 minutes on this because I could talk for like a semester about all of the reasons it's beautiful and wonderful. So I'll try to keep it brief. But really, qualitative research focuses on experience. I said that before. The direct human experience of being in a place, the direct human experience of being someone who uses a particular system or is in a particular cycle, and also the experience that's born out of conversation with others, people who actually care and take the time to listen. It's amazing how many times I've had people cry in my interviews and thank me, tell me that it's better than therapy, that somebody actually caring what it was like for them is a really powerful thing. But then also the experience of sitting together with people and trying to collectively make sense of things. Qualitative research provides rich and holistic data. It offers more than a snapshot because it allows us to trace things as they happen in a sustained way, like processes that unfold over time are, you can get with longitudinal data, but through observation or by, interviews and narration, it becomes a way of getting at things as they unfold over time. It's great at looking at practice as opposed to merely policy, which is what the rule says should happen, but it looks at what actually happened or what people's perceptions of what happened are, which matter because people only can ever respond to their perception of what happened. It honors local participants' meanings. It helps explain, illuminate, or reinterpret quantitative data. It allows for multiple viewpoints and stories. It's necessarily complicated and messy. You cannot add 2 interviews together, and because you can't do that, it forces you to deal with complexity. You can use it to preserve chronological flow, documenting what events led to what consequences. And ultimately, what I argue is that qualitative research you should really think about it in terms of data, democracy, and design. Qualitative research generates data, yes, but it also allows more voices to participate in the process of creating the future, which is my definition of democracy. And not only mine, but other people's. I'm a big fan of Dewey. But it also allows us to design new things, and that by using qualitative inquiry, we can create new programs, we can modify existing programs. So those are all of the reasons that if you are a student, I would tell you, hey, qualitative research is great, but you're not my students. So I want to frame this instead in the context of what sparks qualitative inquiry. So is this, yeah, okay. So I've identified basically 3 places where a qualitative project might start in the life of a nonprofit. So the first one, this data sparks right here, sometimes we are looking at data and something just makes us go, huh? Just totally surprised, right? You're looking at a series of numbers and something is way off. Or you're looking, at a variety of populations, and you're like, why on earth is it like this? Now, sometimes it's because your numbers are wrong, and you need to go back and fix them. I had that happen to me last week, where I've been working with people who had included the children of families in unaccompanied youth, right? So it made it look like our unaccompanied youth had wildly spiked up. So that was a huh that was answered through data quality, not qualitative research. But sometimes you go back and you make sure you check the number and it's still what it is, and you don't know the answer, right? And you either want to corroborate that answer, you want to find more reference points to make sure that it's right, or you want to elaborate on that number. You want to understand how it came to be, what's connected to the before and after. Like you say, you're noticing that there's more older adults who have been couch surfing for some years, and you want a broader story than just that moment where they're walking to the shelter. You want kind of a broader perspective. The other kind of thing that data can spark is sometimes you're looking at data and you've got a very important decision to make, and you have a theory. You think that this is the explanation, and because of that something something should be done about it. But you really, really want to know that you're right. And one of the things that qualitative research is really good at is proving that you're wrong. And so there's a strategy called negative case analysis where you can go into qualitative data to try to disprove your explanation. And it's a really rigorous way of kind of checking your assumptions about why something is happening. So those are 2 data sparks. Qualitative inquiry sometimes sparks out of programs. So you've got a new program to design. Maybe there's new money, or people have identified a new priority and you need to make a new program and you don't know how. You can interview people who've done them before, or you can interview people who maybe the program is targeted to. And so you can use qualitative inquiry to really bootstrap the project of design. And you can bring stakeholders together around a common set of questions and get them to imagine and build together. You can also use it to evaluate existing programs. So if you know that it's working, but you know that it's not working for everyone, you could dig in using qualitative inquiry to the folks that it's not working for. Or if you can't explain why it works for some people or others, sometimes qualitative research can kind of play out the differences that just aren't in your survey data. And then lastly, with regard to programs, Jamie and I were talking about fidelity checking, which is basically asking, like, are we really implementing this model as it is? You might be running a Housing First program, and you've adopted only 1 or 2 aspects of the Housing First model, but not the rest. And so it becomes a way that you can kind of like peer past what you say you're doing and look at what you're actually doing. And then the lastly is stakeholder sparks. Sometimes we find that we desire to increase participation from a particular set of stakeholders. So if we notice that even though we invite residents of a housing project to a meeting which will decide a policy, but nobody comes, that might be because they don't care, or it might be because they don't feel comfortable going to a meeting. And so qualitative inquiry is really good at finding ways to engage people in modes of interaction that they're comfortable with. And so even though you don't have to always have everyone all of the time showing up to every meeting, you can get a diverse set of participation by designing interviews or focus groups to get people, as part of the conversation that decides how you move forward. And then lastly, with regard to stakeholders, this is specifically, with regard to clients. If you notice that clients or residents or consumers are pooling, if there's a gap in their experience of the organization, or there's a spot where everyone's getting hung up, qualitative inquiry can kind of go into that place where the system is pooling, and kind of tease out what is happening there for folks. So with all of that said, I now ask, can we imagine possible qualitative projects for our sites?
So does that mean, Tim, like, is there something the data's pointing to in our system or anything that we would want to go look at, like the number of elderly coming in from Doubled Up or wherever, and try to understand? But other examples, like, is there anything, any kind of spark in the data that makes you want to find out more? And HMIS is not enough. Just observable data that we get. And what is it I would think that there is, everyone on the call has had some experience of a spark like that.
Well, here at the Road Home, we have engaged with the local universities for a project that is yet to get off the ground, but we're going to be looking at working to look at the families who have returned to shelter who are specifically placed into a rapid rehousing project, and then to see what factors it was that resulted in them returning to shelter. I mean, there's a lot of families who don't return to shelter, but those that do, what specifically was it that caused them to do so? So we're looking forward to that project, but that's something that's been hard to determine from the data itself that's captured in HMIS.
Yeah, I love it. Do you know how that project is going to be designed? Do you know if they're doing interviews or focus groups, or?
It's going to be interviews with families directly.
Okay, yeah, great. And so that's a perfect example of a place that bears out in your HMIS system. Like, you can start to see that data if you analyze it in the right kind of way, but it does not tell you the why. It just tells you that it happened. So yeah, great. Other thoughts, possibilities. You don't have to describe the project. You can just describe the problem, or the question that you have. Like, oh my gosh, I wish I knew the answer to this.
Okay, we got a good example out of Utah. That's a good one.
I like it. So the slide, by the way, has like hints down at the bottom in case you are having imaginative blocks. But I often think in terms of evaluation, design, supplementing HMIS, trying to get at client experiences and understanding best practices. Best practices is a weird one, but we often look to what's wrong. But if you have a program that is really kicking butt and has great outcomes, and it's easy to forget about it because it's not squeaking. But sometimes it's worth asking, why is it working so well? And if we change it, well, what should we for sure not change in order to preserve that which is good about it? It's actually harder to understand why things work than why things don't work. And yeah, qualitative research becomes a good way. Any other last imaginations or questions before we move on? I'll give you maybe 10 more seconds to wade in before we move. All right. So let's talk about how. Like I said, I am not going to teach you the totality of qualitative research today, but I want to give you some sense of what the process is. When Jamie and I were planning this call, we had these sort of twin desires. On the one hand, I want qualitative research to seem accessible, a thing that you can do, a thing that you want to do, but I also don't want to give you a false sense of simplicity or ease. Because sometimes you need help, right? It took me a long time in my academic training to get very good at it. And so it's both a thing that, right, we all of us, we wouldn't be human if we couldn't walk into a place and make sense of things. But doing that in a systematic way that gets beyond our own perceptions and biases, that really invites, perspectives from multiple people. And also, just lives up to the rigors of good, analytic observation, is challenging. So anyway, so I want to walk you through a little bit about what each of these frameworks looks like, and maybe give a few examples from my own work, how they go. So field observation is basically the qualitative research of being in the world. You have to observe the field in order to do it. This is the work of the ethnographer, right? You go out into the world and you try to understand how it is that people are making sense of themselves, or interacting with the material world, but also constructing meaning between and among each other. So the process is going out and visiting the field, spending time in the actual place. And the common practice is taking some kind of notes in the fields, either scratch notes, like taking down like quick scrawls, or typing things into your smartphone, or making mental notes of what happens, and then returning home and writing full accounts of what happened in the field. When you do field observations, you attend to space and people and objects and interactions and events. And of course, when designing a study, you want to be thoughtful about who is in those places where, and what interactions are happening at what events, because of course you'll miss some things if you only show up, between the hours of noon and 3, and the story may be very different after 8 o'clock at night. And I'm not going to get into all of the details, but generally speaking, field observations often start with recording, just trying to offer an account of what happens. But there are also narrative styles of field observations where you tell stories. They can be field stories of the field researcher themselves, or they can be of other people in the field, so you can shadow people as they move through systems. They can be kind of conceptual explorations, where instead of observing everything, you narrow your field to only observing a specific thing, like looking at what happens at the shelter from the perspective of the door, right? Like just posting at the door and trying to account for the door as a phenomenon. It's super weird, but is often really telling because there are things that we take for granted. And then memoing is writing analytic asides throughout the process. And maybe the most important thing about field observation is that field researchers observe how they observe. So they're attentive to the language that they use, whether or not they are describing or evaluating things when they write. They try to pay attention to their biases and assumptions, because just everybody makes sense of things when they walk in, but you need to watch the way that you watch in order to account for your version of the story. And as you segue into other forms of data collection, it can be important for being able to incorporate other people's interpretations of the scene into your own. You don't actually need to do field observation to come up with an opinion. You all have an opinion about the place that you're visiting. And so you need to be self-reflexive is the technical term, or just the easier way of saying you need to observe how you're observing in order to make sense of that. So the second frame.
Tim, I just want to make a note here. So in doing this and in having Tim describe this, what we're really, our ultimate goal is empowering you all on the phone and whoever listens to this in the future to know the language when you're talking to your qualitative research partners. Not necessarily do it yourself unless you have some education in it or some background, or you're becoming a part of a team, so you can bring in it. So it's really, this is really trying to just empower you to have the language and familiarity so you can ask the questions and go deeper with your own qualitative partnership. So this isn't, the hope is not that you become a qualitative researcher from this.
Agreed.
Just to clarify.
Yes, thank you. So with regard to interviews, the process there, the thing that you're looking for with interviews is to get at what is it like for you to experience something. So while you can do field observations and you can watch, you know, people in a drop-in center, or you can pay attention to the way the outreach workers talk to the folks that they meet when they're on outreach, you don't actually know what's going on in the life of the other person. You've got guesses, you can read their body, but you know, qualitative research really puts a premium on people being able to represent their own reality. And so interviewing is ultimately data through empathy, is the way I think about it, and it's letting the interpretive world of the other person be the thing that kind of like sets the foundation. So with regard to interviews, you establish your inquiry goals. A lot of people think that they can just do some interviews and then give the data to somebody else and they can analyze it and tell them what they need to do, but that's not at all how it works. You need to design your interviews really mindfully in order to get at things in a particular way. The order that you ask interview questions in is super complex, and so that becomes a thing that you need to know the goals of your overall inquiry before you can design your interview. And so if you have partners, they need to be involved, you know, in understanding that goal setting, so that the interviews can be designed in a way that's attentive to the given goals and context. So then you sample and recruit interviewees. Sampling, there's very strategic ways of doing it. Depending on the kinds of arguments you're going to make, you'll need to sample in different ways. And, you know, research partners will be able to walk you through that. Interviews should be done in a fitting style. There's a variety of kind of postures that interviewer can take. And so that should be, people should be trained for that. And it should be done in a way that's most conducive to the project. And then recording your interview data, you can take notes or you can record audio, and sometimes you transcribe the audio so that it becomes a written file so that it's easier to analyze. And then we also give thank yous to participants for interviews most of the time, because if you're going to ask someone to spend 15 minutes or an hour or 2 hours talking to you, we recognize that there are opportunity costs that has, and so, you know, gift cards or objects that are valuable to them. I find that grocery gift cards and bus passes are usually pretty valued. And then lastly, with regard to the frame, is focus groups similar to the interview in their overall process. The reason we do focus groups instead of interviews is because of a thing called the amplification effect, which I will summarize very briefly by saying, if you ask 5 people a question, even though all 5 of them might have really vibrant experience about a subject, if it's hard to talk about, if it exists on the fringes of their experience, or maybe, you know, it's a way that they've been taken advantage of and they don't recognize they've been taken advantage of, it might only come up in one of your interviews, and you might discover, you might then therefore make the claim, oh, you know, a small number of people have this experience. But when you put them together in a room and you have them talk, and that one person who would have shared it in the interview shares it in the focus group, all of a sudden the focus group just erupts. Oh my gosh, that happened to me too, da-da-da-da-da. You know, oh, I can't believe that. Why did we not talk about that more, right? It becomes a way that something that might remain hidden in more of a one-on-one setting kind of gets pulled out in the group setting. Getting people together in a group comfortably is a really powerful thing. It also prevents people from bullshitting you a little. In interviews, they can say whatever they want, but in a focus group, the fact that they're in a group, it kind of like puts a little social pressure for people making up stories, because they'll know that other people, you know, in the focus group also know. So anyhow, you establish your goals, you design your focus group protocol, and you try to sample and recruit participants into groups with similar traits. And so I was recently working with a permanent supportive housing organization, and they wanted to do an assessment of well-being with regard to rapid rehousing and permanent supportive housing. And so we decided that that experience was different with regard to rapid rehousing and permanent supportive housing. So we split those two groups into different groups. And then the direct staff really thought that men and women would experience those things potentially differently. And so they wanted to split them into groups of men and women. And so we had a kind of 2-by-2 model, men in rapid rehousing, men in permanent supportive housing, and so on. And so what groups you break people into, kind of depends on the traits that you want the focus group to highlight. And yeah, okay. So then logistics focus groups are mostly in exercise and logistics, finding the space and the facilitators and all of the materials and all of the different things. But then, yeah, on the actual day, you facilitate conversation to invite participation. And at this point, I'll make a note, there are endless varieties of ways of facilitating focus groups. I've recently been into object-mediated focus groups, which is a fancy way of saying we bring toys and have people build stuff, and they talk while they're building. And so both what they build and how they talk about it is the data. And it can be a really powerful way to get people who have had, who have opinions about how things could be better, to kind of build and imagine and model. And so you record either in notes that are audios, and then have participant thank yous. Before moving on, I want to say that there is also a side of qualitative research which is maybe less visible, which is the analytics side. And I'm not really going to review how it's done. But basically, you need to decide what form you're going to analyze your data in: written, transcribed, audio, video, pictures. And then who is doing the analysis, and what skills do they have, and do they have the right skills? And then there are a series of analytic tools. There's software like Atlas TI or In Vivo. You can do it in Word or Google Docs, but there are significant challenges to that. And I'll also say that the software, there's no qualitative software where you just plug in all of the data and it gives you a finding. It's not like running a statistical test. It's still an interpretive exercise, but there are a series of strategies for working through those interpretations that are pretty well established in the qualitative fields. Often it means reading for themes, which we often call codes, and those codes can be generated by the reading itself, which is like a more grounded approach, or you can come into a set of data with a set of ideas that you're looking for, and that can either be motivated by the question that goaded the inquiry in the first place, but it can also be in conversation with other things that we already know. Maybe that's other data points, or other published scholarly literature, or other projects that you've done inside your organization. And so, yeah, that's that. Let me stop there before I move on to the who. Does anybody have questions that are just bubbling up from the cracks with regard to this kind of more how orientation, with regard to field observations, interviews, or focus groups?
Will you touch upon funding later, like where you might get funding to do this, as you talked about all those different possibilities and steps?
Yeah, absolutely. Let's make that part of the who conversation.
Okay.
All right, hearing none, I'm going to move on to this question of who should be involved. So really, qualitative research is about bringing together diverse people and having them think together and to share experiences and to come up with explanations for how things work in the world. You could just think of qualitative research as knowledge through interaction. Like, that would be a lovely way of thinking of it. And so I've got kind of like 4 food groups with regards to possible participants in the research process. And so as you can see, I think in terms of your project participants, your clients, your residents, your consumers, past or present, then you have your staff, direct staff, executive staff, volunteers, the people who are the actors inside your organization. And then there are various opportunities for research partners. Maybe that's professors at local universities. Maybe it's their students, or possible interns. But it also might be professional researchers in the forms of consultants. And then there's broader stakeholders who aren't coming to your program. They're not paid by your program, and they're not themselves researchers, but they might be board members or potential funders, or they might be people from other sectors, right? So if you're connected, you've got a program that's connected to young people, it's possible that you want to include stakeholders from schools, or other kinds of programs. And so I come from a tradition called community-based scholarship or participatory action scholarship. And the goal really is to get a diverse set of people participating in the project as it unfolds. The truth of the matter, though, is that that's not always practical, and that sometimes some people should be involved in different parts of the process, and sometimes people shouldn't. So, to give a for instance, you might want to involve program participants in the designing of a project, but you might not want them analyzing the data, because if the data is about other participants in the programs and people are bearing their souls and telling stories, it might be a profound violation of their privacy to let people whose lives are pretty connected to theirs read through their transcripts. So you really want to be thoughtful about who should be involved and in what stage. And so what I would love to do, instead of just me lecturing on this, I would love for us to take one example of a potential project and just kind of work through it as a group and see where people thought different stakeholders should be involved. Does that make sense?
Let's try it. Let's see let's go for it.
Love it. Okay, so I didn't catch your name, but the person with the road home who's spooling up a project on families returning to shelter.
Yes.
What's your name?
D. Norton.
D. So do you mind being the guinea pig?
Sure.
All right. So you say that the project has started. You've talking about it. So have you successfully designed it? Would you say the project is designed?
So we are working with a group out of the university using their knowledge base and their research team to conduct the research itself. Right. So we're not part of the design necessarily, and they have not started it yet, so I haven't seen the final design yet. Okay. So the research partners are offering, are part of this design. Has anybody else been involved in that design process, or just them, you say? Our staff has been involved in helping to identify, so we will be providing them the information from HMIS of the families who are returning to shelter from rapid rehousing programs, and the facility director of the family shelter has been involved in the overall discussions with the planning to get it up and running. So
right. Yeah, okay. Love it. Do you know who's going to generate the data or collect the data? Who's going to come in and do the interviews?
It will be the research staff from the university.
Okay.
They have a person who will do direct qualitative interviews with the client, while also having one of their data people from the research team. They've received HMIS data from us as well to help corroborate or help flesh out what that qualitative information will be providing.
Yeah, love it. You probably don't know. Go.
Tim, can I just say for 1 second? Just conceptually, like right now, this information is really because we do believe that you should be more a part of it than just the research team. That like I'm part of a large study with a very large evaluation firm. I'm going to not name who they are, but they are very smart, brilliant in methodology, but they don't understand the population. And we've worked really, really hard. That we have healthcare for the homeless physician on the team, also 2 of them. We worked really, really hard to make sure how the questions are asked are the right questions, the approach, the understanding. So maybe your research team is grounded in this, but this is also to support our involvement with the academics in designing this and asking these kind of questions. So I just want to promote that as we go forward.
Yeah, and so I can tell a story on my own end. The first qualitative research project I did in permanent supportive housing, the model was relatively new to me. This was a few years ago, and I had only ever been involved in outreach and drop-in organizations up until that point. And I had all these questions about, community and how community flourishes or doesn't flourish. And I showed up to them and I was like, hey, I want to do an ethnography in your permanent supportive housing organizations. And they were like, okay, what does that mean? And I kind of explained, the different aspects of field observation and interviews and focus groups. And they really came back and said, I think it's going to be creepy for you to do field work in these people's houses. Don't. So if that's like a thing that you need, that's a deal breaker. And I think that I would have figured that out pretty quickly when I started, but it was really valuable for me to not just like walk in as a researcher, because in a drop-in center, somebody visiting is more appropriate. It's more of a public space, right? And at the time, I just didn't understand that, or I didn't get that. And they were able to also infuse their own questions into my research study. So they were like, well, we don't want you to just looking at any program. We just recently built this building. It's the first building that we've ever made that was explicitly for permanent supportive housing. Other projects in the past, we've just taken old hotels and redone them. And so we want to know if our design is successful at creating community in the ways that we wanted it to. And so they were able to shape not only my research project from the perspective of an ethical standpoint, like make my research more ethical. They were able to infuse their own kind of organizational, program evaluation, really is what it was, into, this project that I was doing. So Jamie, you're right on, like the strongest of these things comes through partnership, right? And by having multiple people being involved in different parts of the process. Love it. So we don't need to, hopefully you get the point of this grid now. But when I design projects, I really do think through, okay, so when I'm doing this project, should clients be involved, and if so, how? Should the direct staff be involved? If so, how? Should research, do I need research partners? If so, how? And what broader stakeholders? And to ask that question at every single level across the board. Now, you will not fill this in with perfect X's, and I wouldn't even say that's the goal, right? As I said before, it depends on the nature of the data and who has what skills and whatever. But you do want to think in the context of who has the most insight for moving through this. And so maybe you don't get program participants to design your study, but maybe you circle back after you've created an interview guide and pilot test it with a couple of program participants first in a real explicit way. Like, these are questions we're thinking about asking. I want you can answer them, but I also want you to give me feedback on them and tell me whether or not I should be asking these to other folks. And you're like, oh no, that would be super insulting. Don't ask that question, or that's going to put people on the spot. Or, oh, you can ask that, but make sure that you offer this caveat first, or something like this. Does that make sense? So yeah, love it. So we've been kind of going through this who, what, when, where, why framework. The where is really not that complicated. It's in your organization and some of its programs. But really what's valuable to think through is what is the space going to be like? Who uses it for what, when, and what will the impacts that the qualitative project has on it. So I'm going to go back to who, because I skipped a part. And I know that Jamie and I have talked at length about this. One of the things that you want to be thoughtful when engaging your different stakeholding groups is what they need and why they're showing up in the first place. So as staff of an organization, you're showing up because you want to run a successful organization. You want to answer a question that's vexing you. You want to design a strong program. And so those are the reasons that you're there, right? But why would a research partner show up other than out of the goodness of their heart? And sometimes that's enough reason for someone, but it's often not enough to purely sustain it. The people who only show up to your organization for the goodness of their heart are volunteers, and they can't do everything, right? Volunteers, are important and necessary, but not part of the entire picture, right? And that question also carries for program participants. Why would they come? What are they getting out of it? And also with broader stakeholders. So I'll speak to the research partners one explicitly because I myself am a university stakeholder, so that's the world that I move through the most. So what does a university partner need in order to want to come? And really the answer is pretty straightforward. They need funding or publications or both, right? So our world is defined by research, right? We generate new knowledge about the world. And so one of the important outcomes of our work is that we write about things in the world. And so if you find a university partner, it can be some kind of a negotiation between what is this going to cost me and or how can they write about what is happening inside my organization in a way that benefits their research trajectory. And so sometimes that might mean that you really, really want them to study one thing and they're more interested in studying something else. And it could be the case that a little bit of creative negotiation means that you can let them see some of what they want to see, and they'll also do the thing that you want. Or it can be a matter of finding the funding to pay people for support. Certainly consultants. There are not that many pro bono nonprofit research consultants that exist in the world. And so that, that's a space where, you're hiring a group of people to do an external study of your organization. I will say that if you're getting something for free because you've got a professor who is really intellectually interested in your work, that there's always that, but they're a volunteer, so it might be a little slower or less reliable. And so if you want something done well and fast, that's probably always going to cost you. But it's also possible that there is someone out there whose whole intellectual life is tied to work that you do, and that you can be a really powerful partner to them. It might mean putting up with their students instead of paying them. But yeah, being able to work through the things that kind of motivate and need them. Jamie, do you want to speak to funding and how much it costs to evaluate programs and things like that?
Well, it's such a wide spectrum, right? People think that qualitative research is actually less expensive than quantitative, but in fact, it often ends up being more expensive time-wise for all the amount of time it takes for doing surveys, follow-up, focus groups, and also the actual analysis. But these budgets run the gamut, so I don't know how to actually speak to that other than they do run the gamut. And I think it's more important to be framing out what it is you want to do, and then thinking about who your local funders are who care about that issue. But funding research is also kind of tricky. One of the funders for homelessness research and that's more rigorous is the Arnold Foundation. For those who don't know about it, that it would be more of a mixed method, combining qualitative with quantitative research to them. But anyway, the budget can run the gamut, and Tim and I talked about this. Yeah. So I don't want to put any numbers to it. Because it really, I don't want to block anything from going forward that way.
Yeah. No, I appreciate that. So last little piece on research partners. Universities will need time. Oftentimes, almost always, the nonprofit time scale is shorter than the university time scale, and so that's a thing knowing going in. And if you need something on a particular timeline, and that's like a drop dead kind of date for you, you need to be clear about that. We have institutional review boards we have to apply for. We also, often have to review bodies of literature at different stages of the process, and so it may seem like, gosh, like you've had those interviews for a month. Why don't you have findings yet? Well, it might be that I hit a road bump in my analysis, and I've got to go out and get more theoretical tools to bring back to the data to understand what's going on. In real practical ways, we need permission letters. And often we need orienting to the way things work, and Jamie was speaking to that earlier. We don't think we need it, but we really, really do, I promise you. And so, with regard to university partners, the number of acronyms that I have had to, choke through and Google secretly on my phone in the middle of meetings is pretty profound. And so, if you're working with somebody, be thoughtful about the kinds of orientation that like a new person needs. So as we're kind of wrapping up our time together, we've got 15 more minutes. So I want to talk a little bit about cautions and considerations. Questions that I often ask myself or encourage my partners to ask is how can we prevent undue exposure and protect privacy? So this is basically all of the data concerns that we have about quantitative data, you also have about qualitative data, right? People are going to be telling their health narratives. They're going to be, maybe talking about times that they broke the law. So you really want to be thoughtful about who has access to what parts of the data at what stages, and make sure you're really clear with your clients about their permissioning. Some people want it to be out in the world. I tell them that it's private. They're like, no, I want you to publish this audio file. So, you want to include them in the, in understanding where the data all ends up. But you don't want to, expose people. You want to protect their privacy. You also want to avoid being invasive. There's spatial invasion, like I was talking about in the permanent supportive housing project that I wanted to do field notes in. We ended up deciding that I could do field notes at community meetings because they were kind of more public spaces. But you also want to be thoughtful about what counts as personally invasive. And so that sometimes means that you shouldn't ask certain questions, but sometimes it means instead, what questions do I ask first, so that I, as a researcher, can decide if I should follow up with different kinds of questions. There's also rules of appropriateness, which you probably know or often know in the context of your different programs, but your research partners may not. So just recognizing what is appropriate given particular social settings. And then really the question that motivates partnerships is what aspects of this project will go poorly without help. And so, one of the things that, I encourage is to think of qualitative inquiry, in small ways, is a thing that is immediately available to you all of the time. You can, if you want to know what a program is like, go and visit the program. I noticed that the larger and larger organizations get, the more and more spatial separation exists between decision makers and the actual program spaces, right? So like going down and visiting, the food pantry can be an important step in making decisions about the food pantry. So, you know, I don't want to make a field observation or an interview seem so out of sight that you need to find a funder to pay a university partner to do it. Like, walk down there, ask people, do you like this, right? But as you start thinking about what that looks like on a larger scale, because you'll have gone down in a random time and talked to a random person, and if you have a very small sample, just in the same way with quantitative research, a very small sample can be misleading. As you think about how to make the project bigger and more robust and more vibrant and more rigorous, you know, what kinds of support do you and do you not have that exist inside your organization? So those are like my questions and cautions. So what we were thinking is that maybe one of us would be interested in designing a project today. Does anybody want to work through this series of questions in conversation with Jamie and I in front of all of the rest of us to just kind of prototype a possible project? We promised we won't hold you to it, but sometimes just play is a good space to learn. So would anybody be willing to share a spark of a project idea and then have me ask some questions so as to work through what we've talked about?
Okay, so I think, you know, people don't have to do that. I think the idea here is you go back to the PowerPoint when you have more energy, because we didn't maybe have coffee during this long session or chocolate, but if you use this PowerPoint as a reference to some of the concepts and look at especially this worksheet, and allow yourself to have the right to work with researchers who sometimes do have a level of hubris about them, but really understanding what the goals are of the qualitative project and why you want that, and really working through like becoming a partner in that. That again is our goal of the call, is empowering you as partners going forward in this process. So we hope that some of the resources have been helpful and that you can refer back to them when you're considering or even while you're in partnership with whoever might be doing a qualitative study with you.
Yeah, and let me just also say that as part of this community of practice, in the same way that you followed up, you know, with the shared housing folks, I absolutely invite you to follow up with me. I'm really endlessly passionate about the ability for qualitative research to make space for new things to come into being. While we were planning, Jamie and I were kind of riffing on you know, what qualitative research does and why, and she said something that was really beautiful, which is basically that qualitative research motivates discourse from multiple perspectives, and it allows for differing interpretation and really creates a container for us to listen to each other's perspectives, which allows discussion to happen. And often where funders are not willing to fund certain kinds of programs, it's because their imagination only goes so far, and that if they could listen to you, who had listened to clients, you know, or people in a particular subpopulation, and if you can carry that meaning and create that conversation in a certain kind of way, it can really clear the path for a variety of, you know, kinds of creative action. And that I often think that we so often talk about policy. What's the policy for coordinated entry? What's the policy for Housing First? What's the policy for you know, this particular program? And that qualitative research really bridges practice into policy and policy back into practice. So the rule, as it is just a thing that got written down somewhere. It's a thing that gets said by someone who memorized it. But the practice, that's way harder to get at. It's very hard to understand what the practice really is, because the practice is happening all the time in the world when you're not watching, and people's interpretation of that policy changes. You know, they might be resistant to it, they might be hesitant about it, they might believe in it but misunderstand it, they might be fanatical about it and the policy's actually bad and their fanaticism leads to, anyway, there's so many ways that policy doesn't become embodied, but qualitative research is really good at getting into that embodied part of practice. So anyway, I invite that there's my contact information, which is connected to the slide. And I very much invite y'all to follow up with me. And if you want to chat over what, you know, projects might look like in your communities, that's something I'd be really, really excited to do.
Well, Tim, this is Amy Appleton, and I'm absolutely going to take you up on your invitation. I've got several things. I didn't want to step up right now because I'm just not prepared to.
Yeah, sure.
I'm very excited about what this offers, and mostly what I'm doing is qualitative. I've got plenty of data. I'm very transparent, but you know, there's so many stories and how you it's just mind-boggling. You can't translate the human aspect of what my program does, and how to capture those HUD dollars, the heat funding, all housing first and all that stuff. I mean, I really, really could use your help. So I thank you for this. It's pretty exciting for me personally. So thank you.
Love it. Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. Other thoughts or questions?
Well, Tim, I think I also thank you. I think it's planted, I think, some real seeds as a reference point for folks going forward, and you know, it's quite comprehensive, a little mini course we just got, but I think it's great. It's really, I think I learned things also on this, and very thought-provoking. So thank you, and I do urge people to call Tim for any advice or potential work or connections with other universities that he may know of in the field. So.
Yeah, and I'll just say last little plug. You never know what you might be able to get for a very little amount of community engagement. There are disciplines that are very committed to activism and to understanding social justice, and the university setting is really often trying. We like are ahead on the thinking but behind on experience, and we often know that. And so there are sociologists and communication professors who are like, their disciplines are desperately trying to account for the things that you all already know how to do and maybe even take for granted. And it's possible that, you know, being able to reach out to them and say, you know, if you're interested in social issues connected to A, B, or C with populations of 1, 2, and 3, then maybe we can work something out, because we'd love to review, you know, get some evidence-based review of our programs. And these are the kind of opportunities that exist. Universities, some have like community partner luncheons, but just Google also, right? Like find your local universities and start thinking about the key terms that, you know, people might define their research by, that could be really powerful partners. And the truth is, they're like waiting out there too, you know, who want to partner and create really cool relationships. So, yeah, it's a thing. That's all I have to say. I've stopped 4 minutes before the hour. 3 minutes. All right. You want commercial for our next meeting?
No, well, here we go. We're December 5th will be our last community practice session of the year. It's going to be an exciting one on data visualization. Andrea Miller from our team of Clubbers is going to be presenting on it, and really you'll go away with tools and practices that you can apply with your data that you don't know yet about. So we look forward to that. between now and then, amazingly, have a fantastic Thanksgiving holiday, and hope everyone stays safe in the fire world.
Well, thank you, Jamie, for what you're doing.
Thanks, and thanks, Tim. Okay, bye-bye all.
Bye.
Bye.